Okay, so content warning on this one. Possum is a film that has some themes in it, and they are real bleak. You know, it's kind of a miracle that I ever watched Possum, because I personally am deathly afraid of spiders. And the poster for Possum looks like this. I know technically that's not a spider, but boy do I not like it. However, it was always something I curiously observed from a distance. I heard good things about it, the promotional image, though unpleasant, was compelling, and I just also have a kind of compulsive need to watch any movie that remotely piques my intrigue, especially if it's a horror movie, to a borderline debilitating level. But the spider vibes just kept this one at an arm's length from me. Though after a friend of mine had assured me, guaranteed me, that the film was well worth a watch and did not actively feature any real spiders. A lie, by the way, there is, although I do think it was a genuine mistake as it's only very briefly on screen and not a major focus. But still, I managed to soldier through and I'm glad that I did. Because even though this horrible puppet thing makes my skin crawl so much I want to eat my own face, the film is a haunting and uncomfortable exploration on the depth of trauma in a way that just feels wholly unique, tragically beautiful, profoundly thought-provoking, and sticks with you hugely. Word of advice though, if abuse is a difficult topic for you, maybe skip this one because, it goes places. Not in a exploitative or cheap way, but just, it goes to them places. Possum is a film about a disgraced children's puppeteer named Philip, portrayed with a quiet, nervous unease by Sean Harris, who returns to his childhood home in Norfolk to stay with his just deeply unpleasant Uncle Maurice, who looked after him when his parents passed away as a child. And when I say unpleasant, I mean unpleasant. Like, I cannot express how deeply unlikable this man is before he even really does anything. The actor portraying him, Alan Armstrong, is just doing such a good job that he's able to communicate the guy's absolute wretchedness simply on pure bad vibes alone. This dude is rotten. Stunning work. The house is a mess due to a previous fire, and the uncle just kinda lives in it in a state of disrepair, adding to the misery of the situation. It's unknown exactly why Sean has come back home. It's very much implied that he basically just needed to get away after he was disgraced in his career, though it's never said exactly what he did. Though, disgraced children's puppeteer certainly raises an eyebrow or two, because what exactly can you do in that line of work that would see you socially expelled from it? Whatever it was, it becomes a recurring subject in his bullying uncle's torment, who takes every opportunity that he sees Sean as an excuse to belittle him somehow, whether that's making fun of his failure in his occupation or getting him to recount stories of how he was bullied as a child. Subjects that still very much bother him are brought up as if they were fun, jovial party anecdotes, only the uncle is the only one that's laughing. As if that wasn't bad enough for Sean, there's also something that's becoming a real thorn in his side. Possum. That's what he calls this hideous, uncanny spider puppet thing with a human face that he keeps in a duffel bag he carries with him everywhere. You see, the thing is, Sean doesn't like Possum. Neither do I, as it happens, Sean. Can't blame you there. And he keeps trying to get rid of it. Though seemingly, no matter where he leaves Possum or what he does to it, this freaky marionette monster keeps returning to him somehow. And it seems that Possum has, in at least some capacity, been a permanent figure in his life, as while at his childhood home, he finds a twisted book he wrote about the character when he was little that depicts Possum as an evil monster who comes and eats orphans from their bed. And throughout the film, we hear Sean mentally narrating with verses from the childish poems he has written about Possum's monstrous ways. Other strange things are occurring in Sean's life as well, that the audience doesn't totally understand. Throughout the film, there is a door within the home that Sean regularly approaches, but whenever Maurice asks him if he's going inside, he always refuses and leaves it alone. Meanwhile, children are going missing in the area, specifically a young boy called Michael, and it's reported that a man matching Philip's description is wanted as part of the investigation, something that causes Maurice to quip that Philip should not bring attention to himself or trouble back to their home. Add to that, Philip is treated with suspicion by everyone in town, who seem cautious around his admittedly very strange and nervous disposition. He carries the kind of mannerisms and character of the sort of person who can very easily put you on edge, just due to the fact that he always feels a little on edge, and that sort of energy becomes contagious. And if he wasn't panicky enough already, he also keeps having these haunting nightmares of Possum creeping into his bed while he sleeps. And that's kind of the plot. When you hear it explained like that, you might be thinking like, wait, what is this? What you've just described is just like stuff. You're just saying things that happen, but how are they even really connected? Other than get rid of the puppet, what's anybody trying to do here? What's the film even about, really? Why is he back home? What's with the police stuff? Is Philip like dodgy? Is the puppet supernatural? I don't really get it. And listen, trust me, Possum isn't so abstract and disconnected as to be inaccessible. This isn't me recommending you another experimental film like a Skinamarink or something. It's just very much a vibes movie. Possum isn't really a film that sort of sets itself with a clear immediate path and goal for its characters to get anywhere. Yeah, he wants to get rid of the puppet, but the puppet isn't like a villain in the same way the monsters in Evil Dead are. It's not something that just needs to be defeated or suffer death at the hands of. It's just this strange thing that has this weird, disconcerting quality to it. There isn't really a clear obstacle to overcome or fate to avoid. It's a film that's more focused on delving deep into the sensations that its imagery and subject matter evoke. It's a movie dripping with subtext, which is kind of ironic because of all the people it could have been written and directed by, it was made by Garth Marenghi himself.
I know writers who use subtext and they're all cowards.
Yep, Matthew Holness, the comedian who created the hilarious Garth Marenghi's Dark Place, put this one together in his feature film debut. And apparently the guy is absolutely multi-talented in the writing department, because it could not be further from his usual efforts up to this point, but nevertheless he manages to put together this finely crafted, dark, mature an unsettling piece of cinema. And he didn't just write it, he also wrote the short story it was adapted from, and he directed it too. On a technical level, the film has a really well-defined style that feeds into its strange mix of unnatural discomfort that's somehow very much grounded in reality. Visually, the film has the aesthetic of a kind of old kitchen sink drama, a term used to describe a British cultural movement that developed around the late 50s/early 60s that focused on these social realist, working class issues, often depicting a very real, very unsensational Britain. Probably one of the most famous examples would be Ken Loach's film Kes, about a young boy in a crappy home environment with no school prospects adopting a kestrel and finding meaning in that relationship. If you look at Possum and you look at films from this movement, you can see the similarities in that it has that kind of muted colour palette that extends not just in its grading, but in the aesthetics of its locations and the costume design of its characters. There's lots of degradation present in the scenes, lots of grey skies and just a very vintage British feel, even using things like CRT monitors to draw from this aesthetic of the past. Holness actually said the biggest inspiration for its visual style came from the kind of public broadcast children's safety PSAs of his childhood, which if you live outside of the UK, you will not know how genuinely messed up some of these things were. I think most people have some familiarity with public service announcements, but in England, instead of softening things by getting G.I. Joe to say watch how you take prescription medication, or having a little rainbow with a star gently tell you how good it is the more you know, or having Sonic the Hedgehog tell you that you should talk to someone if an adult touches you in strange places, the UK, bizarrely for being a prim and proper conservative place, did not hold a thing back when making these PSA films. These videos always painted a cruel, uncaring, grounded world and seem to just relish the opportunity to murder children at a moment's notice. I remember getting shown this one called Never Rest as a kid. It was a farm safety video shown at our primary school, and it had like a body count, you know? I half expected James A. Janice to pop up in the corner and start racking up the numbers. Just dead kids out the wazoo. A kid drowns, another gets run over by a tractor wheel, one kid gets her arm completely torn off by a piece of machinery to a bloody stump. This film was wild, and may I just add as well, by the way, my school wasn't anywhere near the vicinity of a farm. I have never been to a farm in the UK in my life. I have no idea why we had to watch this. Later on I saw an even more messed up one online called Apaches, which I'm not even going to remotely show you this clip, but just to give you an idea of the kind of tone it sets, there's a scene where a kid drowns to death in a slurry pit. Look up what one of those is if you want to be scarred. The point is though, I can see why these films stuck with Holness and why he chose to pull visual inspiration from them. It's such an interesting and inspired horror aesthetic to evoke, especially in a country that has such a vivid cultural memory of them. And these things were horror, by the way. I almost dedicated an entire episode of this show to British safety PSAs before I had to pull it for time. Consider this video the little crash course in that world that you're getting in its absence. Even with this grounded and realistic approach to the film though, the movie still manages to pull off some impressively creative visuals and cinematography. There's a great deal of imagery that reinforces the spider motif present throughout the film, like the use of the aesthetic of this tree here that literally looks like spider legs coming out of the ground. And as the film goes on, the set pieces it pulls from its main puppet tormentor are as terrifying as they are impressive. Speaking of, I should probably give this hideous thing its flowers. What a disgusting, horrible, awful, and truly brilliant piece of work this is. I understand it took them quite a few goes to get this puppet right, but the end result is just a wondrously awful design. It is so vividly uncanny and unpleasant to look at, and the way Holness and his team hold back on how much you actively see of it while making it still feel like this terrible persistent presence throughout the whole film is some truly accomplished work. The film's visual design and style marries perfectly with the dark subtext of its subject matter. Garth Marenghi be damned, the subtext in this film is very good. Thematically speaking, this is a movie about abuse, trauma, and the weight that carries on a person throughout their life. And to really sing the strengths of this aspect of the film, I'm afraid I'm just going to have to get into spoilers. I kinda danced around them with the initial synopsis, which is why it maybe felt a bit all over the place, but to really analyse this thing you have to talk about it as a whole, so it's pretty much unavoidable. But to be honest, this isn't really a film that's spoiled by knowing its plot points. It's far more concerned with the feelings and ideas it's communicating than any of the traditional beat-to-beat hits of its narrative, if that makes sense. I don't know, I'm kinda yammering at this point. All I'm saying is if you want to stick around, I don't think you're going to lose anything from the experience should you wish to then watch the film yourself. Okay, so, throughout the narrative, there's obviously an allusion being made to the idea that something is very wrong with Philip. He acts weird and nervous all the time. The creation of Possum is obviously a very disturbed one, and the film sort of implies, through his never quite articulated disgrace and our own stereotypical assumptions, that maybe he's a bit dangerous around kids, for lack of a better word. The boy who goes missing is one that Philip had initially had a brief interaction with on his journey home, and we're never really completely clear on what Philip is doing at all times despite following the narrative from his perspective, due to him suffering recurring episodes of blackouts. It's an implication that's seemingly reinforced throughout the film through the police investigation, encounters with mistrusting teachers when Philip passes by his old school, and some of the things his uncle sort of knowingly alludes to when he mentions how this current kid stuff was similar to an incident with a masked man assaulting children, a moment which causes Philip to break down in tears and his uncle to uncharacteristically comfort him. Now the thing is, though the film seems to be playing with this idea of Philip as a disturbed individual, pairing his strange behaviour with repeated glimpses into his tragic backstory, no parents, concerning childhood writing and drawings, a history of being extremely bullied, the whole thing becomes this massive red herring, one that plays on the audience's own prejudices of how we read his behaviour. A weird, quiet, shy, slightly abnormal man who works with children and plays with puppets? Must be a creepo. I think this is another reason the movie never actively tells you what he did to ruin his career, so that the audience can assume that his disgrace as being someone who worked with kids must have been something really dodgy. Even though the far more obvious and simplest possible explanation would be that maybe the giant, totally inappropriate, freaky spider-human hybrid puppet he has a strange relationship with and can't seem to get rid of, just putting it out there, maybe scared some children. Could have just been the scary puppet and not the scary man who caused the problem here. The actual reality is that Philip isn't the way he is because he is an abuser. Philip acts the way he is because he was abused. Philip's uncle was physically, emotionally, and the other kindly abusive to his nephew throughout his childhood when he took him under his care in his parents' absence. And it is only with this revelation that everything begins to make complete sense. When Philip was in stressful, abusive situations as a child, he would play dead, like a possum. Possum the puppet being this weight he has to carry with him that he just can't escape is an insight into the weight of his trauma. When you begin to examine the possum puppet through this lens, there's so much within its design, its strange accompanying poem, Philip's childhood illustrations and the nightmares about it he has that suddenly feel like insight into how much he's suffering still as an adult from the impact of the abuse he suffered as a child. When you see Possum as a representation of Philip's uncle, it takes on this sickening new light. The poem about Possum tells us of how the creature crawls into orphans' beds to devour them. I probably don't need to clarify at this point that as a child, Philip was orphaned, and what connotations a monster crawling into a child's bed may have. There's a recurring element to the film where Philip often tries to assert some control over his uncle by repeatedly pointing out the house they are in is his house, not his uncle's, as a small way to gain some kind of dominance back. But this is juxtaposed by the fact that Philip throws the creature away, wrecks it, even burns it, but it still crawls its way back into his bed, in his home. So whose home is it really? Who is the one that has the power here? Interestingly, rock spider is an old prison slang for paedophile, and the visual motif of the spider here is notable as it conjures imagery of a real predator/prey relationship. It's a relationship of total dominance and control. A fly has no power in a spider's web. It gets no say in its bodily autonomy. It doesn't even get the option to try and flee. Possum kind of draws on that idea of being trapped in a web, and it's a really uncomfortably complex depiction of this trap because there are times throughout this movie when Philip actively goes to his horrible uncle for comfort, which is sad and disconcerting when you know what's went on between them, but also a very honest depiction of the kind of relationships some victims have with their abusers. Philip's trauma constantly pulls him back to the source of it, and until he addresses it completely, it's unlikely he'll ever escape its grasp. The film treats trauma like a purgatory, something reflected in its setting which feels strangely empty and bereft of life for the most part. But one thing I really appreciate is that by the end of the film, it feels like maybe, just maybe, there's a chance for Philip to come to terms with this weight and escape this purgatory after the credits roll. I've mentioned before, as I said in my Texas Chainsaw video, that I am a fan of horror that can take us to dark places when they're able to show us some light at the end of it, no matter how dark the journey got along the way. And I personally feel like Possum has some of that catharsis, albeit it gets a little darker even than it already was before we get there. I mentioned earlier about the missing boy Michael and how Maurice commented about the masked man in the past assaulting boys and how this story made Philip break down. Well, at the end of the film, it's revealed that Maurice was this man in the mask, and he attacks Philip after Philip investigates what's behind the door he kept feeling pulled towards, but never felt like he could go through. It turns out this was the site of a lot of his abuse, and in a very hard to watch scene, we then see Maurice attempt to abuse Philip in this room further, notably pulling off long black gloves to reveal highly animated fingers that seem to echo Possum's long spidery legs as they crawl over Philip's face. At first, Philip is paralysed, but when he hears a young boy whimper from a chest in the room, he is able to find the strength to overpower Maurice and break his neck. Opening the chest, he finds the terrified missing boy who runs off, and the final image sees Philip sit outside his house, Possum's now dismembered head sat on his lap. To me, this is not a scene about Philip saving some random child with barely any screen time. It's about Philip stopping an abuse continuing. He has forever been trapped in this cycle of abuse and violence, even when not in the physical presence of it, and that child represents that cycle of violence continuing into another generation, something that trauma has a habit of doing. By finding the strength to protect someone else from this abuse, Philip is able to overcome his own and stop the cycle. And the final shot really reaffirms this statement, as Possum, the puppet Philip created as a means to channel his trauma, a symbol he has tried to destroy time and time again throughout the film, an icon that represents all the abuse he has suffered, now sits broken in his lap. Seemingly not from an action he committed directed at this symbol of trauma, such as when he attempted to hide it, run from it, or burn it, but suddenly it's now condensed to a small fragment of its once large and hideous frame, and only after Philip actively took action against the trauma itself, finally entering the room he could not bring himself to do before and confronting his uncle. And for me, I just think that's another great example of the horror genre being able to deal with some of the darkest, most uncomfortable aspects of our lives and release those fears in a safe and cathartic way that allows us to see a path out of that darkness. In this moment for Philip, Possum finally doesn't seem so scary. He saves the child, but in doing so, he has really saved himself. And I think, for all of the horrible subject matter this movie deals with, that is really meaningful. And on that note, I think we can end it there. So we have wrapped up yet another episode of this celebration of horror. And once again, before we all depart, let me just remind you all of this month's big announcements. Did you know that this month's videos are in support of Trans Lifeline? 100% of ad revenue, donations at the donation buttons on my videos, and my Patreon income for this month will be going direct to the charity, as well as all profits from the Dan Drambles shirt. Mock-up design seen here, the final print will feature a larger, high-quality screen print on organic, ethical shirts, and are available to pre-order this whole month at the link in the description. Also unrelated to the Trans Lifeline charity efforts, did you know a couple other cool things are happening right now? Firstly, if I'm still in the competition at the time of this vid's release, I am once again running once more to be this year's Face of Horror. You can vote for me once every day for free or buy more votes if you're so inclined, and by doing so, you will help the B+ Foundation, which funds childhood cancer research. And finally, did you know that I'm actually a credited advisor on the next entry in the smash hit In Search of Darkness series? This incredible horror documentary saga is making its first foray into the 90s decade, and as an advisor, I'm able to offer a 10% discount on this film. I'm thrilled to be working with the In Search of Darkness team. It's going to be a banger. Check all this out and more at the links in the description below. Other than that, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to my Only Dans with the red button below. Hit the bell so you don't miss the next vid. And I've been Dan Drambles. You're watching Wholesome Halloween 3, a celebration of horror, and I will see you all again for another episode, same time tomorrow.